Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this last session of this really interesting and at times very disturbing also conference. My name is Koechlin, and I have the pleasure and the honour to chair this panel. Now, we have actually come together to discuss a very specific question that the organisers have given to us, which is a successful democratisation process in Southern Africa conceivable under the prevailing structures? And if you will allow me, I'm looking at Barbara here, I will actually rephrase that question in the light of what we've been discussing last night and today during the day. And it seems rather than that the question is, how can we put the wealth that is obviously in these natural resources, in the minerals, in the service of human welfare rather than human exploitation and ecological exploitation. Now, but I do think that the focus on these structural constraints have been highlighted in many different ways today, and I'd just like to draw your attention maybe to the ways that I certainly have, what I have learned in the past 24 hours, and put slightly and ruthlessly simplified, but I think very powerfully, these structures seem to coalesce around money and profit. It's pretty simple. And starting maybe on the most abstract level, and that may be most relevant to Switzerland as well, are the international financial and commodity market, which do provide the opportunities for transfer pricing, for hiding profits, for actually hemorrhaging the profits out of the country where the minerals are being extracted. The second level is the profit principles, or the kind of constraints that the companies themselves within the mining industry are under. Philip alluded to some of these, where of course profit drives these companies. That's what makes them innovative. That's what frames their work, and it trickles down in all sorts of ways on the way in which they are acting. And it seems very much from some of the presentation that within the mining industry, this also serves to frame a kind of culture of contempt with regard to human welfare, and I think the extent is quite frightening actually. Then a fourth level, out of 5, you'll be happy to hear, is the dependency of the labour force on the mining industry as an opportunity for employment, which makes them, of course, very easily exploited, and to a certain extent it seems as if they're disposable commodities as well. And the fifth and last level, and that is something I would like to be speaking a little more about today, is the level of politics. From what we've heard, certainly from our South African guests, is that there seems to be quite a noxious cocktail of greed and impunity prevailing in South African politics, and people are kind of in each other's pockets, and even formally intrepid, and kind of people on the right side have moved to the wrong side for very unsavoury reasons. So with that sort of quite arbitrary structuring of these different structural constraints, I would actually like to start with the more abstract or macro level, but which at the same time is closest, I think, to the area in which we as Swiss citizens or Europeans can intervene. And I was wondering, Mascha, you were doing a lot of work on the international financial markets, on the commodity markets in the 80s and 90s, which you expounded yesterday. And I was just wondering, because I mean, we want to think in these last 60 minutes or so about ways in which we can actually act. I mean, these structural constraints are not, they can change as we know. where do you see points of action? Where do you see, you were talking about triggers, would you identify as triggers where we could intervene as consumers, as citizens, as voters?
Well, you asked me difficult questions. I think when I listened, it's a long time I've really worked about this issue. I worked also on the prices of gold and how many deaths people, the imports of Swiss gold provoked and so on. And the problem is, when I listen today, I think I come from a left, 68 background. There is a big difference between development of capitalism by exploiting and development of capitalism by destruction, ecological and social destructions. It's not the same thing. And I thought, in fact, we should build up a campaign, international, it exists, really, to say you are not allowed to damage, to make damage. It's not the same thing as just to try to make a lot of profit. It's really very serious damage what is done to people working in the mines, to people living near the mines. It's not just about how much profits they make and what is the link between profits and the level of wages. I think it's in somewhat a different question. And when I heard about this very nice law in South Africa, I thought, well, I would say to the South Africans, well, I try to collect money here in Switzerland, but it's very important that you insist that the government really, the trigger point is, if you continue like this, we will take away the license. It's what the American government did to Swiss banks, and this helps a lot. They were ready to pay billions and billions of dollars. And they wanted to speak to everybody and so on. You have to be very cool if you speak about big business. You just have to think about how you pressurize them, which trigger you have to use that they have to do it. And the license is the most strategic thing you can think about. This, I would say, if I wouldn't be an economist capable to read balance of payments. I read, before preparing the speech yesterday, I looked at it, and it's just a big problem. It's first employment, and the second is that South Africa doesn't export enough in order to pay what they import. That means they have a big problem that they need new capital, or that they have to make new debt in order to go on economically. And this is my problem with the whole discourse on corruption. It's very difficult sometimes to distinguish between corruption and blackmailing. The South African government is still in a straight jacket. If companies, you impose companies really the law, then the companies will say we will go away. So I think if you want to have a trigger point, you have to choose a company who will pay a lot, risk a lot of costs, because they don't want to go away. And I think you really have to choose which company. And the straitjacket, I'm quite sure that there wouldn't be transfer pricing, there would be those incredible, real big amounts of management fees transferred to foreign countries, to Switzerland too. Then I think South Africa wouldn't have such a big problem with balance of payment. And I think there the whole international, this level I'm working, or I used to work on, comes in. We have really to identify the amount, the dimension of those transfers of tax evasion and so on. Otherwise, I would say, I think you have laws, and democratization has one very important aspect everywhere in the world, that the government really applies law. That's the whole law, which has been a very good law, and the other level is that you invent laws you need. This is very important level on the important for the national level, and I think part of the corruption in South Africa, everywhere, also in Switzerland, is about not imposing laws. That I think it's a very, very important point of democratization.
Thank you very much. So before we move on to the implementation of laws, which I think is a very important point also for other aspects, health, etc., I would just like to ask Philip, actually. You were mentioning the companies, and also, I mean, in your presentation yesterday, you actually painted a very bleak picture of the mining industry. At the same time, you pointed out to the fact that there is a great diversity, even within, of course, between the sectors, but also between the companies. And I'd be interested to hear where you see pressure points. If it's not profit, what is it?
I'm reminded here of a play I went to see in Johannesburg a few weeks ago, which involved John Carney. Just if you've heard of John Carney, great actor. He's partially in exile during the apartheid years, and he said, "We wanted freedom, we got democracy." I think that really hits the nail on the head. The second point here, I think, in dealing with the mining industry, I don't think you can effectively utilize moral appeals and humanitarian appeals and arguments framed in terms of human decency. South Africa, and I might be grossly exaggerating this at the moment, is a carpetbagger country. Simple as that. The bottom line in South Africa in many respects is people who are on the so-called gravy train and want to stay there, and people who are not on the gravy train and want to get there. That's the bottom line of politics in South Africa. As far as the mining companies are concerned, as I've said, I think a little bit earlier in a comment I made, what keeps the mining executives from the smaller to the bigger company awake at night is this Sustainable Development legislation, the Mineral and Petroleum Development Act. This act has never been effectively implemented. And it points to the fact that, as Mascha was saying, there's law, and it may be on the code books, it may be in the statutes, but whether it gets applied is another thing altogether. We have in South Africa what some people would argue is one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. We have a strong Bill of Rights, we have a relatively free press, we have quite a strong civil society in South Africa despite everything. But one of the major problems is that the laws, many laws, Constitution and everything else, when you look at how they work on the ground, don't work at all. I mean, the Vama Republic also had a perfect constitution, if you remember. I think if you read the Soviet constitution, which bore no relationship to Stalinist reality, it also had perfect laws, but they were never applied. I think in South Africa the trigger point is to, as Mascha was saying, generate compliance. Get people to comply. Not by moral appeals, but in terms of putting on the table business interests. Because that's the way you speak to mining. Mining, for example, is very sensitive to the fact that it costs roughly 6 million rand every time someone dies. That person has to be replaced, there's production disruption, there's insurance claims. And we have, at this point in time, about 105 deaths per year, which is not astounding in a certain sense. It's 105 too many, but it's not hundreds of thousands. We also have a lot of people who are injured. All this costs money. And that's the kind of configuration which you need to use with mining companies. This is in your business interests. I know that's not a very savoury way of doing things, but my understanding of South African mining leadership is that they don't understand largely anything else. You've got to actually appeal to them in terms of your economic interests. It pays you to be safe. It pays you not to take lives. It pays you to invest in new equipment and new technologies. That's the bottom line of the game. Now, as far as the diversity of companies is concerned, we focused on a couple of the biggies here. As I said, Anglo-American, we focused on De Beers. I mentioned BHP Billiton earlier. In actual fact, there are, at the last count, 367 companies in South Africa. That's a lot of companies. And they range from sort of fly-by-night, black empowered companies, kind of small, with maybe a small coal mine somewhere, right up to the big international players. I think it will be very difficult to, I don't want to use the word force, persuade the Anglo-American group or persuade De Beers or something to comply with the law which we have in place there. But and of course, as Mascha said, the first thing they'd soon say, well, we're divesting, we're getting out of here. But you could do it with one of the smaller companies. Monitor a smaller company, see where they're complying, where they're not complying, and use that as a test case. So that's my take at this level of the conversation at the moment.
Thank you very much. So we have reputational risks, we have legal risks, and then of course we have a lot of pressure we need to apply. I'd actually like to turn not just to the left, but I would like to turn to some, I think, equally, if not more important aspects. And I was very intrigued, Bishop, by your remark that what is really needed now are collective solutions, is an inclusive agenda. And I was kind of mulling it over as you were speaking, because what we were hearing from the other speakers is what I think you, Philip, called an effective breakdown in communication and a completely dysfunctional leadership, if I may say so, on all levels, on a community level, on a company level, and also on a political level. And I was just wondering whether you could say something about how such an inclusive agenda, how such collective solutions could be found under these circumstances where there seems to be very deep-rooted suspicions and dysfunctions on a social and political level going on.
Thank you for the opportunity. I think personally the answer lies on us, people with conscience. It may be difficult to appeal to morality issues, but I think that we can work on people's consciences because we believe on what is right. And what we see right now is the desire for people to accumulate material possession as a consequence of that, of greed really, there is something about me that excludes the other. And therefore, in order for us to find a common solution, we need to have a common agenda. And a common agenda, I want to believe, can come as a result of conversation. I think the difficulty we are faced with right now, we're not talking people. We think a lot. We don't communicate what is in our minds, because sometimes our minds are ruled, our hearts are ruled by our intellect. And as a result, we miss out on what I think is critical, human relationships. I said earlier on that the problem, as I have experienced it, is that business put interest above human life. And I was saying that we need to shift the paradigm and say people first, then material gains, so that we can think about what it will mean if it happened to me. If the company, this practices, whether it's toxic water, whether it's pollution in the air, and it causes me to have difficulty breathing or experience headaches, how would I feel about that? And so I have to think about the other person who may be more vulnerable than I am. And especially it's women, it's children who don't have a voice. And I think we, with conscience, we can actually help by enabling those people to appeal their cause to the wider community. Now, I don't know how you actually challenge politicians who are desperate, who are vulnerable because companies today are more powerful than the governments. Government exists because of the company's financial contribution. And therefore it's very, very difficult. In my context, I think it would be very difficult to point at one politician who has not been corrupted somehow or other. The black economic empowerment system that Philip was talking about, I think it's a good practice, but it has done more damage than good. It's a fact. People are aspiring to be part of the rich elite, and you have a sense that they go into political work in order to make gains rather than service delivery. And this is why they are more protest now than they were in the Apartheid era. One could argue and say, well, in the Apartheid era, people got shot for protesting and boycotts and was back to work. But the truth is, there's a lot of unsatisfaction from ordinary people, because when they voted for the new government, they believed their lives would change. And it hasn't happened. It hasn't happened. As I said earlier on, the gap between the poor and the rich is widening instead of closing. And that is dangerous, because if we were not careful, there would be class war. And I think, even though I have not thought it out very clearly, I think that we should consider and think seriously how do we manage economic revolution? Because it is at our doorstep. I think there will be time when the working class stand up against the capitalist system and seek to replace it. We spoke earlier on about possible nationalization. It may sound far-fetched right now, but we don't know what the future holds. Unless we get involved and be in dialogue with each other and try to understand where people are with their thinking, maybe we can move collectively to a particular position. So I do believe, and I'm convinced, and I've seen it happening, that where people talk to each other, where there is a discourse, people tend to find each other, even though they differ. But ultimately, they do find a common position from which they can correct the situation as they find it.
Thank you very much. I would like to pass on to Vama and maybe pick up on some of the things that Bishop said. You are a former miner. You represent, or you work together with ex-miners, and you were discussing and showing us what the incredible health hazards are that these miners incur. And as we saw in the film, for instance, also the surrounding communities. Now, at the same time, it seems to be that politicians in South Africa and the representatives of these very, very miners are acting in very irresponsible ways, in very self-serving ways. And I was wondering whether you could maybe share some of your thoughts, also maybe some of the thoughts of the miners themselves, the communities themselves, on how they could bring about a change in this attitude, so they actually act in the interest of, in this case, of the mining communities.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I think on the matter of the situation in South Africa, and as well as how it impacts the mine workers and ex-mine workers, it's quite a very complex problem. Looking at the current leadership of the government of South Africa and the governments in the various countries, South Africa is actually facing a very big problem of migration, where these countries like Lesotho, Swaziland, Mozambique, people are flocking to South Africa to seek employment, either to the farms or to the mines. And on top of that, when you look at the incident rates of either HIV in these countries, it's very high. And you come around and you find that they've got the issue of TB in the mining sector. And that actually causes a big problem. But when we look at the current leadership, there is commitment, but the commitment is actually very complex again. Because if you can remember in the morning when Bishop talked about the deputy president being a shareholder at the Lonmin and Marikana, and on the other hand, being able to buy buffalo wool for millions, but on the other side, unable to negotiate for a living wage for the mine workers, and instead trying to suppress the voices of the mine workers. That is a very big challenge that we are facing. And also looking at the power, the power of employers, it's a very critical area also. When you look at governments and the balance of power between employers and government, it seems as though the employers have got more power. They've got more power in a sense that they come up with money, whereas government is also a beggar to them, as well as we employees are beggars. So in that sense, you will find that the rights of employees and the nationals are compromised in that sense. And looking at those issues, there was also, I noted that there is mining license and the living of some different legislation that has got some sort of a protection. When I look at the mining license taken, it's quite impossible because of the power struggle between the employer and the government. Most of the time you find that the government will end up compromising not to take the license because they never did it before. So then I doubt that they will ever come to that route. And also the issue of migrant labor and xenophobia. When you look in South Africa, the xenophobia is something that is actually surviving. They don't actually look at migration as an opportunity. They look at migration as a threat. So it creates that cocktail of problems. I'll make an example. We've got a company that is mining coal in Swaziland. And that company is owned by the Swaziland government, by the South African government, which is the Chancellor House. But on the other hand, they look at migration as a threat. And then I also noted when Frankel was talking about the the legislation on the side of Minerals and Petroleum Act, where they look at the social plan. Part of the mines are supposed to contribute to social plans, which is part of, I can say that the corporate social investment, planting back to the communities. And when you look at what Bishop was saying in the morning, he said that maybe they invested in the wrong place, in the local community, than to where they draw the labor from. This plan is only limited within South Africa. They have drawn labor from Swaziland, they've drawn labor from Mozambique, they've drawn labor from Botswana, Malawi, and others. But then, when it comes to some of the acts that has got more to do with social protection, it needs them to break the barriers of the borders. But to end, I'll say yes, there is a solution.
I'm glad to hear that.
There is an elephant sitting in this room. It is so big that no one's even noticed it. I sort of vaguely mentioned it in my presentation. That's the South African military. The fact of the matter is, if you look at the transition to democracy, which I have in considerable detail in 3-4 books, the transition to democracy in South Africa was only possible because the military sanctioned it. South Africa has one of the biggest militaries in Africa. What we're doing with them at the moment is sending them on peace commission, on peacekeeping activities to Somalia, the DRC, the Central African Republic, where they are taking very heavy casualties. No one mentions the military. I know the military very, very well. I consulted with them on the redesign of the South African Armed Forces. No one's mentioned the military here. And yet the transition to democracy was only made possible because of separate negotiations between MK, 11 other armies, and the South African Defence Force, which had wreaked havoc in the whole subcontinent. It was a very narrow squeak, because if you read the new book that's just come out on it, it's available here by General Constant Viljoen, who was head of the South African Defence Force. In 1994, as elections were taking place, there was Plan B. Plan B was, if the elections are a disaster, if the elections don't work, if it results in social breakdown, the military will take power. Don't forget, this is not an unfamiliar thing on the African continent. It's not unfamiliar right next to us. Zimbabwe, Lesotho. 3 weeks ago, the military rose against the civilian government. And it was only constrained because of the fact that Lesotho is so dependent on South Africa, and South Africa said, no, back to the barracks. To throw another complex issue into all of this, there's labour, there's mining companies, there's corporations, there's social movements. Don't forget about the praetorians. Just a thought.
Thank you for that comforting thought. It's actually a very worrying prospect and a very worrying picture that I think all of you are painting. I mean, if you're talking of a revolution, I mean, violence is in the air, I think, and it seems to be quite tangible, actually, that might be ignited at any point. And there, of course, the army would play a decisive role. But before I open the panel to your questions, because I know you were a little squeezed earlier on, I would actually hope for our panelists to give us a solution. I would like to, no. I know it sounds idealistic, but I'm Swiss, so I may be idealistic. No, I don't mean that in a flippant way, actually. But we are here, the room is full of activists, a lot of you have achieved a lot in your lifetime, and I think it would be very important to share just one or two suggestions what people in this room can do, but also maybe people at home. Bishop, may I start with you?
Yes, thank you for that. I think that there is a temptation in which we find ourselves trapped. We are very suspicious of each other, and therefore we are not reaching out. I think for me as a clergy person, I have a responsibility to speak in such a way that people sitting in the pews can say, well, there is another way of doing business. It cannot continue as if it's still the same management. There must be a change. And then again, it brings me back to the issue of conversation. One of the things that has been, for me, helpful, I think the last speaker, my namesake, was very helpful in that the information that my organization has extracted from the companies and the communities is helping him to address the same issues. So there is a possibility that we can work together in engaging the captains of industry here in Switzerland and in South Africa. And I think the knowledge that we are working together is sufficient to make the industrial captains think of the alternative. And so I think that there is a solution, as Jele is saying, but we need to work together towards it. This inclusivity, this common agenda that we need to work on. Partnerships, I think, are important. I think, as I said earlier on, that we don't talk, but we're also very isolated from each other. we don't know what others are doing. And forums such as this are helpful in that they're empowering. They give us something to work with, knowing that it's happening elsewhere as well. And in today's world with technology, it shouldn't be a problem at all to exchange information. And so I think that the emails, the list of the emails should actually become useful in terms of reminding each other what we spoke about here, the work that has been done and how that work could be pursued back in our constituencies.
Thank you very much. If I may pick up one aspect here, one very kind of hard and fast aspect, I think the data that the research that your organisation did was very important for kind of campaigns here. You, Vama, you mentioned that more data would be necessary also on the health situation of the workers, or the former mine workers.
Thank you, Chair. I think on the side of moving forward, I'm happy that we are moving forward. The first one is on what Bishop had just said, the platform to share. This is the beginning of a platform to share, and we would like to see this happening. And he also alluded and saying that the emails and others can be also complementing the efforts. And also looking at the issue around research, it's one of the components that I think we need to be very strong to it and to inform decisions, because currently we are working on estimates. I was actually happy when one of my minister of Labour in Swaziland have moved a step to say, let's look at how big is the problem. Where she say that if it costs to know the issue of TB in the mining sector, is that easy? I think the first thing we have to do is to get to know how many are the living mine workers and what is their conditions where they are, which is very important. And we have a document in that one where they've got the concept paper for it. And then the third one, we have to look at how we can address the issue of migration. But in that space of the issue of migration, we are working very well with IOM, which is International Organization for Migration, where they look at how best we can enrich the understanding of why is migration there and how important is migration. And also to look at how countries, I mean the SADC, which is the Southern Africa Development Communities, states, how can they engage each other when it comes to the issues of migration? So then we can have a good understanding and we'll never ever experience xenophobia again. So that's why I say that, yes, there is a solution.
Thank you very much. If I may pass to you,
Yes.
Billy.
Let me spoil the party again. I think that I agree with everything that my colleagues are saying here. I agree with the fact that we need a lot more research. There are huge areas of South African experience which haven't been documented, where policy has been made in a vacuum of information by people who think they know what is happening, by government officials who definitely know what is happening, but won't necessarily provide evidence of that. Yes, there's a huge need for research. But I think we're confusing here two debates or two conversations. The one conversation is what to do with the mining industry, what to do to the mining industry, depending how you look at it. The other, and I thought this was what Lucy was speaking about, is what is the solution for everything? The silver bullet. Because you can't change much in mining unless you change the social context in which all of this takes place. And there, although I see it in a kind of dogmatic way, you can't appeal to South Africa's peoples on the basis of morality and good sense and decency, you have to hit them in the pocket. I do agree with Joe that talk, that interchange of information, all of that is important. But having said that, the problem about South Africa in the end is a collective psychological problem. It's a cultural problem. It has to do with the fact that people were brought into this great social experiment with wildly exaggerated expectations. When the ANC came to power, the place was going to change. It was going to be the Rainbow Nation. It was this country which was vaunted as a wonderful place with a wonderful leader who is Mandela, who's gone, and that's not inconsequential because he was a great iconic symbol in South Africa. We didn't make, and I don't think we've still made the cultural and the psychological adjustment. We have an elite which is no longer a white elite. It's a white and a black elite, which lives in a universe which is entirely different to reality. I mean, where some of us live in South Africa, it's see no evil, know no evil, and if you keep your eyes closed and you don't have to try very hard, the injustice is unseen. You have to look for it. It's not always visible. So we're living with this elite which believes this is a workable, modernizing, high technology society. It's not Zambia. You can't make the comparison between Zambia. You, in fact, can't make the comparison between South Africa and any other country on the African continent. South Africa is South Africa. It's modern. It's got a system of roads. One of my colleagues once said, "You'll never have a revolution in a country which has highways like this." And I think in a way he was actually right. The level of racial prejudice, at least on the side of the people in power, is mind-blowing. We talked about this a second ago. Casual, hurtful remarks about race are common conversation, unapologetic, complicated conversation. And I've even had new members of the black elite who have risen to power saying, you know what, this comes into my thing about the military. I'm sick of this democracy that we got here. As long as I can keep my BMW and my corporate job, I'd welcome someone who would restore order here. So there's a lot of conflicting mindsets going on, and as Joe points out, in the end, I don't think a lot of people trust each other. They don't trust each other. They have no investment in talking because the stakes are so high or because the interests are so protected. So what you've got to have, and this is true of the mining industry as well, is a change of mindset. How you bring that about, I don't know. Maybe someone on Madison Avenue can give us a game plan for changing public attitudes and the level of relationships between people. That's really what this is all about. It's about relationships, as Joe pointed out. It's about trust in a society where the conflict, the inheritance of the conflict which we had has done such terrible damage. And there's no other way to put it. We've inherited a really tough situation in South Africa. There was no magic wand, and now that the older generation of leaders are disappearing or too old to function, the newer generation of leaders, both business and political leaders, are very, very worrying. They have been brought up in a country where corruption is how you do it, where getting to the top is the only thing that matters, a harshly materialistic society where, as I said, many of the people at the bottom want nothing more than to get to the top, and there are political parties who are playing with this idea and stoking up these feelings. We won't mention any particular names. There are several political parties who are now getting on the bandwagon of racial discontent. And they're starting to bring this whole thing up again. So that's the kind of thing we've got to, in a sense, guard against. We've got to keep people's mind focused on what is decent, what is tolerable, what is human rights. I don't think a lot of people in South Africa even have the slightest idea what human rights are about. And I can understand that given the experiences which we've been through. My last point is, you know, the impact of apartheid on South Africa was so mind-warping, was so intense. We didn't have Stalinism. We didn't have 20 million deaths. We didn't have Hitler. But we had something much more insidious creeping around. And you can take the structures away, but you're still left with the mindsets. The mindsets are hostile in some ways, not in all ways. So I don't know how you change mindsets in the end. So I have no specifics.
Well, it seems to me you're all working on it. Sorry, a brief comment.
You know, sometimes when you are given an opportunity and you didn't give a thought of everything, you will miss a very strong point or a very weak point or a very important point. The point that I would like to raise is in the issue of how best we can also do on the intervention. And when I look at my points here, I actually look at different angles on the approach. And the other approach that we think that we need to vigorously actually push is the issue around the silicosis campaign, which is the case, because this is the one that will actually unlock the current government to come up with very responsive legislation and also to put the mines to tasks on how they can control the dust in the mine and also how they can regulate some or observe some of the policies that are in place. So currently, when we look at it, it's actually in the very low stage, as Charles was saying, the morning. But on the side of the mine workers, we've got a lot of them that are dying. But there is no way that we can actually leave the case out. We have actually to ensure that at least their families are able to sustain lives.
Thank you very much. Mascha, what can Switzerland do? Can Switzerland do anything against the impunities that companies, multinational companies, Swiss companies, the way that they're acting, in this case, in this southern African context, which is complex in itself?
Well, I was always against the adherence of Switzerland to the European Union because I'm convinced that it would be a big damage to the European Union because Switzerland never has defended impunity, has never done anything to really address all those questions. It was always the last one, the last country in Europe. During the whole anti-apartheid level, you had on this side Sweden, on the other side Switzerland, and in between we had the rest of Europe. So I think we just tried to do our work. We had some success, and there is no other way than that to continue. But I think when I listen now to all those proposals, there is missing something which existed during anti-apartheid struggle, and this was a very decisive plan to have success, to have an idea how to do it, and you do it in a different way in respect to business than in respect to government and in respect to civil society. And you are very much experts on the civil society level, but I think we need experts who know very well how to trigger, how to play the business card and play the interest of business. And also, I think also the government issue in South Africa. When I went to South Africa at the end of the 90s, and always if I listen to people, they accuse people of being corrupt, etc. They are, I'm sure. But the problem is you have to talk about their job. They have to impose laws. You have to ask about their performance. It's much more important than to speak about their morale. Don't speak about morale of powerful people, speak about what they really do and what's their performance, where they did well, where I think it's since I go to when I went to South Africa, it's always accusing people of being corrupted, of changing sides and so on. How do you know if they changed sides or that they couldn't do otherwise, that it was not possible? We need to discuss about possibilities and not possibilities. And the second is, in fact, the morale of a CEO doesn't interest me. I want to know how I can bring him to do otherwise. And this is how, by just playing with their interest. You have to make it very expensive for them to create so much damage. And also for the image, that's what we can do in Switzerland. They are worried. But you have very good laws in South Africa in respect to this. And I think we didn't have laws in Switzerland with respect to anti-apartheid struggle, no law at all, not even information. But now you have in South Africa, you have something we don't have in Switzerland, very good laws. And I just ask myself, it's part of empowerment of democracy that people get aware, just come and say, we want you to impose law.
I hear what you're saying, and I think it makes sense. For instance, when you talk about withdrawal of mining licenses and such things. But in my country, there is sufficient evidence, even as I speak to you, that our president ought to be imprisoned and is walking up there. There is sufficient evidence that Mugabe ought to be in jail, and he is not in jail. So these people are controlling the system, and the masses actually don't have any other means. And therefore, personally as a preacher, I need to appeal to your conscience. These are moral issues. These are issues that I must raise so that they keep you awake at night. When we had I go to the Falun Commission to witness, because I was one of the evidence givers. You'll be surprised that there are junior journalists sitting there. The international journalism is in Pretoria listening to Madörin case, which is a very isolated issue. The issue that has disturbed the world is not being highlighted. And why? It's control and power that is accompanied by resources that people have. And therefore, if you say, I'll put you in jail, I mean, I said something that made people very angry when I gave testimony to the Falun Gong. Police in South Africa cannot be trusted. We have sufficient evidence of police corruption, and they get away with it. And even if they do appear before the judges, they don't last. The good classic example is Pistorius. who commits murder and gets 5 years when he's supposed to get life. So how can you trust the application of law in situations of that nature? I have a problem with that personally, because I think that we can do better than that. If we had power of citizen arrest, maybe it would be a different case. We have suggested, I have suggested to some church leaders, let us call collectively for the resignation of our president. And people say, no, 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 it's not time yet. Let's just wait for it. When is the right time? They fear the repercussions that may result in that action.
I'm looking at the organisers.
I was just about to ask Joe, so if our current president resigned or was forced to resign, or even further in one's imagination taken before the courts, there's a very strong possibility that we would end up with someone even worse. Because the fact of the matter is, I can't think of anyone else.
This is why they're not appealing to conscience, that people can change their lives.
I can't think of any other senior politician who I'd rather have. At least this is the devil you know.
Okay, Mascha, please.
In holidays I read the book of Pierre Bourdieu on the state, the left, very famous sociologue, French sociologue. And he says the state doesn't have only the monopoly of the army and violence should have. The state has also the monopoly of the symbolic order of what we think is right and wrong. And they said, even if you have a constitution or if you have laws, and you speak about corruption of that Zuma is a criminal and so on, it's very important to always say that there is a law, because this is which creates a sort of national psychology. But psychology is created very much by the state. So I think it's very important to speak about bottom lines, destruction, decency, and so on. That there are things you never can do, you never should do. But the other thing is really to insist that this is part of politics and state, the law. And I agree with you. Of course, you have to put the criminals, try to put the criminals in prison. But if you look at the time after Nazism in Germany, it took quite some time really to, and a lot of people were not put into prison who have. I think it's really a fight on this level, and I think it's one thing is very important that you say it, it's okay, but the other thing is important to think about how you really get some examples, some persons into prison. You never will get everybody into prison. And the other thing is how
people in prison at this particular point. There's no more room for you.
Which company, first company, will once lose a license? These are those things which change the course of in a country.
One point. Final point. I'm coming back to the not the solutions for the whole country, the universe, and everything else, but simply the mind. In the whole of South African history, including since 1994, there has never been a single mine official or of any significance. I mean, there's always the fall guy down at the bottom, so to speak. But there's never been a single mine manager who has been convicted of negligence, who has been convicted of violating the safety regulations, who's been convicted of running a mine which is is hazardous and deathly, not one. They are
I think it's going to happen with loan management because they were negligent. People would not have died if they had intervened.
But not one. And now, of course, what is happening is we're running out of mine managers because no one wants to be a mine manager because they know that they are seriously at risk for what they do. Before, you could take the poor old supervisor and you could chuck him out and you could say it was your fault. Now, I think it's a very positive development. We're going up the chain of command, which the TRC should have done a long time ago, go up the chain of command and see who the real criminals were. But in the mining industry, yes, we're going to do that. We're planning to do that. Whether it ever materializes is, of course, another question altogether. I mean, when you have an airline accident, you don't sue the pilot, you sue the company. They must take responsibility. And that's what we're trying to do, what some people are trying to do, the mining industry. That's why we haven't got mine managers, because no one wants to be in that exposed position.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. We were planning to open the discussion up, but with the lively interventions from our panelists, I think the discussion has run its course. A very difficult situation, no doubt about it, intractable in some parts, but I think very tractable in others, and I think some of the benchmarks that your foundation carries in its name can actually be achieved. So thank you very much for allowing yourself to be squeezed like lemons and sharing your thoughts and knowledge and experience with everybody. And I would like to hand over to Barbara Müller. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for that very competent panel discussion, and thanks to the panelists.
I must say that I was really hoping that we would have at least a short little bit of engagement with the panel, because I think that there are a number of issues that have come out that I really think needs a little bit of engagement. In fact, in a way, they were fairly sweeping statements that were made, which I think do require a little bit of closer scrutiny, because it creates some very serious perceptions, particularly in the issue of corruption. I have very strong views about the corruption in South Africa. I think it is a problem, but I think the way in which it is portrayed and contextualized could potentially be very dangerous, because it creates the impression that we have a black government that is corrupt, and that by implication black people are corrupt. And so, but that in itself, my response to that is an oversimplification. So it really needs and it requires a little bit of more thought to it. And the reason why I wanted to specifically raise this is, I mean, with the dawn of democracy in 1994, we had a series of bilateral investment agreements that were signed. A new democracy that has absolutely no experience on the international world. And those agreements were signed with the help of international institutions. And the very first to knock on the door were the powerful arms and ammunition companies supported by Western governments. And we contracted the biggest transaction in the history of this young democracy, being our arms procurement, but overwhelmed by the corruption of arms companies from the West. But the way in which corruption is being portrayed, it is portrayed as if it comes from the South. But we barely reflect on the way in which Western governments, supported by the corporations with huge slush funds, I mean, to think that you will be able to stand up to those temptations. I take myself, coming from where we come from, I wonder whether if I had been in government, would not have fallen for these huge, I mean, you can just imagine you've never had it before. And that's no excuse for corruption. I mean, South Africa, I mean, it is intrinsically corrupt. But I do think that there are some serious, we need to really consider the flip side of the coin. And too often that is missing in the debate. Too often we make the very sweeping statements that create some, these, but I mean, that's one aspect, and I really wanted to raise a number of other aspects, but so, I'll leave that as it is.
Charles, I think the mistake was that you were not on the panel. Then you could have really fully participated. But what you said about corruption, I just wanted to underline it and remind people here that in Switzerland, companies could deduct expenses for corruption from the tax until some years ago. So it was really an accepted practice, and it was seen as a way of doing business. So I fully... it is now my honor and pleasure to conclude the conference, and I would like to thank everyone. I don't think I have ever participated in a conference where there was so much expertise, commitment and engagement, open engagement in debates, and you could feel that people were not talking just about the subject they know something about, but subjects they feel strongly about it. And as Bishop Joe has said, it's an empowering exercise, I think, for all of us. Feeling the commitment of others, feeling sometimes close to being overwhelmed by the size of the problems that we are facing, but at the same time also feeling the energy that is there, and where each and every one of you is active and committed and has also achieved something. It's not so that all has been failures. A lot has, in all the different fields where you are active, has been achieved. And from my experience, if you come together with people in the way we have done the last 24 hours, something will remain. And from my side and from the ADR campaign side, I can say we will take it up and we will follow up and try to find ways of engagement, of follow-up, of trigger points. We will put our creativity and the newly woven networks together to come up with something that can be tangible. We are all small wheels. We will not change the world, even so we are about 50 of us. It's always a small contribution we can make. But I think what we can, we will do it. And I would like to thank all of you for the contributions, for also enduring the strains of the intellectual effort to follow everything, the nice weather outside, sitting inside. And I would like to thank our guests from Southern Africa in particular for having taken the trouble of coming here. And I would like to wish you a safe return back home, and take the empathy, the solidarity with you, and I'm sure we will be in touch. Thank you very much. And I hope to see many of you tomorrow when the film is being screened.